made me sweat. One of the things that we gave the families, thank you, Eric. One of the things we gave the families was a jar full of 976 pennies. And just as kind of a reminder of how significant that time is, but I will tell you that those pennies go fast if you're looking at them in terms of a week. I was all but a mess last week as my almost 17-year-old was looking at colleges. And I looked over to my wife, and I know I travel a little bit, and I said, "This is terrible when immigration is not in the house." And I just started crying. And then I have a 5-year-old who is trying to take over the world also. And so one of my favorite times of the week is taking my girls to school. I got to do this with Immigrace for a long time, and we would just have some great conversations. She's a captive audience. You know, she would ask me questions. I could speak blessing into her life. I could just spend sweet, sweet time with her. Now I get to do that. She's driving, so now I do that with Lucy. And so we're headed to school every morning. We're headed to school, my 5-year-old. And we slow down significantly in the school zone. So she says, "Hey, why'd you slow down so much?" I explained to her, well, this is the school zone. This allows us to be very vigilant and thoughtful about those around us. And, you know, I said, well, if I exceed the speed limit in the school zone, I could get pulled over and get a ticket by one of the police officers. And she goes, "Oh, you mean like what happened when you were speeding on the way home from Colorado?" I said, "Yes." I didn't actually get a ticket, but I did get pulled over. And so we, as if that's a justification, right? So we keep heading around to drop her off, and we kind of go through there, and it's a sweet little school. They have some people that are helping her out of the Jeep. And so as soon as the gentleman opens the door, she goes, "Hey, my dad got pulled over by the police." No context, no nothing. And I look at Adam, and I just kind of go, and he goes, I got you. F.B. Myers says it is a terrible thing for a sinner to fall into the hands of his fellow sinner, right? Now, it's one thing when you're getting condemned and criticized by a 5-year-old. It's another thing when that's happening or you're participating in that in another space. You know, I don't know if you've noticed this, but we have the tendency to gravitate toward criticism and condemnation. I mean, even the algorithms on social media are designed in such a way to move us toward more criticism, more condemnation. But the reality is we enjoy or sometimes even gravitate toward people who are critical as well. And there's a reason for that. I mean, if we have an issue with somebody or some organization or some political party or whatever it may be, we find validation when somebody else has another issue. It may be completely separate, but it could be kind of directed in the same direction. And so we may have the tendency to move toward critical people in our own criticism. I mean, we want justification. We want some form of validation. We want to be right. Whether or not we have the facts straight doesn't always make a difference or know the whole story. But here's what we know, is that criticism and condemnation not only damages our own soul, but it never leads to life change in our life or in anybody else's life. And here's the bottom line this morning, is that people don't get judged into life change, but rather they get loved into life change. People don't get judged into life change, they get loved into life change. So if you have your Bibles, I'm going to turn to John chapter 8. We've been kind of walking through slowly. I know some of you, my wife was like, "Can't you just teach the whole book of John at one time?" And we're just slowly working through the book of John. We've been in it a little over a year. And then we do some other series and things. And we're picking up where we left off in November. So this is John chapter 8. John chapter 8, first 11 verses. And it says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives early in the morning. He came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, 'Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?' This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and he wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and he said to them, 'Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her.' And the more he bent down and wrote on the ground," and wouldn't you want to know what he wrote? None of us know. There's different ideas that people may have, but wouldn't that be interesting? Verse 9, "But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. And Jesus stood up and he said to her, 'Woman,'" that was a point of respect too, "'where are they? Has no one condemned you?' And she said, 'No one, Lord.' And Jesus said, 'Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more.'" So here Jesus is coming from the Mount of Olives. He's headed into the temple. And, word had gotten out about Jesus. His teachings, his miracles, other things. The scribes and the Pharisees, they're losing the mic. So they don't have any interest in continuing to hear what Jesus had to say. They want to discredit him in however they can. And so they stage this gotcha moment, right? Now, this isn't going to be the only time that they try to do this. Matthew 19, the scribes and Pharisees try to do this when it talks about divorce. And what we see is that oftentimes the self-righteous have the tendency to take the moral high ground without any type of acknowledgement of their own depravity. And so this is what Jesus is going to be addressing during this moment. And by the way, Jesus isn't discrediting the Mosaic law, but what we're about to see is that he actually fulfills it. John 1:17 says that for the law was given to Moses, through Moses, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So here's what I want us to do. I want us to just kind of walk through the story together and kind of identify with some of the characters in the story. This is a great thing that you can do in your own devotion as you're walking through some of the parables of Jesus, is kind of find yourself in the story. And it may be true that we find ourselves a couple different times in the story this morning. So let's take a look at the Pharisees for a second. Here was the guys that if you had a question about the Mosaic law, they had an answer. They knew it. They had memorized it. Deeply religious. Doesn't necessarily mean that they were godly or that they had faithful intentions. In fact, what we see is that they were arrogant and they were hypocritical and they were calculating, they were ruthless, they were cunning in their attitude. In fact, it begs the question as we kind of see their attitude is how did they even catch her in the act of adultery in the first place? Now, we can't be sure the answer to that question, but we know something's off, something's fishy, because rabbinic law would have been very specific at this point. Adultery was technically a capital offense, and so it demanded eyewitness testimony. So it wouldn't have been enough to say, well, we saw them kind of walk into a room together and then they came out. No, there had to be precise details to this. Hearsay testimony would not have been accepted. So how did they catch her? Well, we don't know for sure, which leads us to another question. Where's the man? Where's the man? Adultery by definition requires two people. It's not likely that the man somehow, escaped, but the woman didn't. Was it a setup? It looks like it. Maybe they talked to the man and said, hey, try to seduce the woman, and then there was a prearrangement for him to be let go. But as we see in the succeeding verses, it makes pretty clear that whether it was a setup or not, they didn't really care about the woman. In fact, the very nature of what we see in this is that they were willing to create a scenario of adultery, they were also very willing to create a scenario where she would be stoned to death. You know, it shows us just kind of how willing we can be to sacrifice somebody else for their own sake. Now listen, I doubt that any of us have participated in a frame job quite like that, but I do know that it's not uncommon for us to blame others even when we don't have all the facts. In fact, often it's when we don't have all the facts. And sometimes we do that in order to protect ourselves or to get our point across. Nobody could produce the man. Why did they expose her publicly? You know, there was no need to do that. There was no need to bring her before Jesus even. Again, clearly they weren't seeking for real justice or to even punish her, but rather there was something sinister that they wanted to do as it relates to Jesus. A double standard. Now, Jesus was a rabbi also. He knew the law. No doubt that he would have understood the context of what was going on. Deuteronomy 17, he would have known that it requires 2 eyewitnesses before anybody could be put to death. In fact, it mandates that the eyewitnesses are the very first people to throw the stone if their story is right. And yet we know that that hasn't happened either. Deuteronomy 19 adds that the witnesses cannot testify falsely or have any type of malicious intent. In fact, if they do testify falsely, the punishment that would have been exacted on the victim gets doled out on the false accuser. But these Jewish leaders would have known this. And Jesus' words just simply reminded them of the seriousness of these charges. Motives matter. Motives matter. And in essence, Jesus is saying, before you pick up that stone, make sure you look in the mirror. Before you pick up that stone, make sure that you're qualified. Is there malice? Is there deceit? Is there dishonesty? Could you be guilty of a similar crime? No question, Jesus saw the sin of this woman, but he also saw the base hypocrisy of the Pharisees and of the scribes. In fact, it might be true that their sin had far greater consequences because they couched it in religious piety. And at the end of the story, what we know is that there was more hope for this sinful woman than for the Pharisees and scribes. But standing up, Jesus looks them right in the eye, and he says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Now that word sin is actually translates sinless. It's the only time in the New Testament that we see Jesus use that terminology. But the result is almost humorous. They're stunned, they're speechless. It's taking the wind out of their sails. I mean, they were sure that Jesus would have flubbed up. Like, he would have probably just let her go. And then they would have had just means to say, you didn't follow the Mosaic law. But in effect, what Jesus says is, yeah, she does have to be stoned. But I will appoint the executioners. And they're dumbfounded by this assertion. I mean, they were so convicted by it, but they started walking out one by one. Perhaps the oldest left first because he had more sin to account for. But it's important to notice Jesus upholds the law. Let's not take the words to mean that adultery is a minor offense. But what Jesus does say is that he upholds the law. That it violates marriage. When it's commonplace, it destroys society. In fact, in the eyes of strict Mosaic law, it's deserving of death. So as he holds up the law, it was a surprise to the Pharisees. But note, that is not all Jesus did here. He also sees the heart of the men. And what he is, in effect says, you are no better off than she is. Your hearts are full of malice and hatred and deceit. And as he reads their hearts, what he sees is potentially worse. There's a saying If the inner thoughts of a man were written on his forehead, he'd never take his hat off. Probably true. You may remember Luke chapter 7, the story of this woman. She's talked about as the woman of the city or woman of the night, and she is taking this alabaster piece of oil, and she's wiping it on Jesus' feet and rubbing it with her hair. I mean, it's this beautiful picture of humility and contrition. And the Pharisees that he's sitting down with, they're saying, man, if he just knew who she really was, he wouldn't want to have anything to do with her. And him hearing this and knowing this, he tells a story like Jesus does about somebody who had an incredible amount of debt that was forgiven. And he looks at them and he says, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. See, the implication is this, is that if we downplay our sin, we're quick to hold others to a standard that we don't even hold to ourselves. We don't see people in the way that he sees people. So again, he doesn't minimize the sin of this woman, but what he does do is he shows how forgiveness actually gives her a reason to sin no more. Well, look at the woman. I don't know if we can accurately picture kind of what's going on when she is brought before Jesus, but I can assure you she is not coming in an orderly fashion. She probably would have been red-faced and dragged. Her hair was in disarray. I mean, angry, upset, rebellious, bitter, speaking out against her accusers. But here's what we know is that when she sees how Jesus handles the crowd and feels his sympathies, she's touched. And Jesus looks at her with respect and says, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And she says, no one, Lord. And Jesus says, neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again. I mean, what an amazing picture. I mean, notice how Jesus calls her attention to the fact that she has no human accusers any longer. He essentially dismisses the jury, and their unforgiveness and attitude disqualified them to be a jury anyways. And then he says, neither do I condemn you. Listen, Jesus, he alone had the right to condemn this woman. He alone is the one who is sinless. He alone is the one who fulfilled the qualifications to stone her, but he doesn't. I mean, the reality is she's already condemned. I mean, she stood condemned by the very fact that she was born into this world. Her conscience condemned her. So Jesus knew there's no need to doubly condemn her. In fact, this was the mission of Jesus, right? John 3:17. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order for the world, that the world might be saved through him. Listen, God doesn't wave his hand and dismiss sin as if it's no account. His holy character demands that any deviation from his righteousness be punished. Justice has to be satisfied unless sin is forgiven. And it's clear here that sin was forgiven. You've heard it said that every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. This might be thoughtful of us here, those of us who consider ourselves saints, to remember our past. Be good to remember it and recognize that there is nothing that we could have done to be made known and to be saved by the King. Rather, he and he alone has found us. And if you're a sinner, it's good news. If you don't know Jesus this morning, it's good news that you can have a wonderful future when you put your trust in him. But note that the order of Christ's words are incredibly important. He does not say, sin no more, and I won't condemn you. I mean, the self-righteous like to say that. Clean up your act, and then I'll accept you, right? But Jesus says, I will forgive you and give you the power to clean up your act. Religion says change, and then I'll forgive you, or change, and then, or I will condemn you. It uses fear and intimidation. And grace says, I have forgiven you. Listen, we don't change in order to be accepted. Rather, we change because we have been accepted. I mean, nothing motivates a new life like grace that has been received. And grace does what rules can never do. It gives people a reason to live Jesus' way, to practice his ways. So again, I don't think that he was giving her a pass. I don't think he was playing her sin down. He doesn't say it's not a big deal. He doesn't say it's not your fault, but rather he forgives her and then sends her forth to live a brand new life. And even though that she's guilty, God's grace gives her a clean slate, a new life, new power. That's what Paul said in Romans 8:1, therefore there's now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. You know, I think if we're honest, we can probably find ourselves either as the Pharisee or the adulterer, probably both at some point. But like the woman, we're all guilty in the eyes of a holy God. We've all sinned. We're caught by God's justice. We're helpless. We're unable to change our condition. We're doomed unless somebody steps in to help us. We can't buy our way out of trouble. We can't deny our own condition. We're condemned by our conscience. And if people knew us even better than they do, they would probably condemn us even more. But that's why the gospel message is so powerful. That's why it's so practical. Is that just when we're about to be condemned again, Jesus steps in and he rescues us from that. What he did on that Roman cross outside of the Jerusalem city walls is he justifies the sin that we couldn't pay for ourselves. So Jesus didn't need to condemn this woman. In fact, he knew that just in a few days later, he would be the one who was condemned on behalf of her. He takes our pain, he takes our shame, he takes our guilt, and that heavy load of sin is laid fully on him. So what's our response to this? What's our response to the passage this morning? And let me just offer a few things. First, I would say this: it is really hard to cast stones when you're washing other people's feet. It's hard to cast stones when you're washing other people's feet. You know, like I said at the beginning, we have the tendency to gravitate toward criticism or condemnation when it validates ourselves. If we're not finding validation in who Jesus is, when he sees us and looks at us and says, you are holy and you're worthy, then we have the tendency to gravitate toward people who will say that through the condemnation and criticism of other people. In fact, we do this quite well. We even do it to the point where sometimes we own the offenses of others. We may not even know. In fact, most of the time we don't know the whole story. But we'll own the offense of another, and we just perpetuate condemnation, division. Listen, if we're not in the circle of the offended, then we probably don't have a role to play in the judgment, and certainly never in condemnation or criticism. So what if we just served people well? What if instead of throwing stones, we washed their feet and we loved them, and we took a page out of Jesus' book right here? That doesn't mean we say, man, your sin is completely okay. That's not what Jesus says either. But rather, we choose to love and forgive in such a way that they're able to see themselves as Jesus sees them. Second thing is this, is extending forgiveness gives people a reason not to sin. Extending forgiveness gives people a reason not to sin. Some of you know my story. There was a phone call that I had with my dad that changed my life at the end of my freshman year in college, and drugs, alcohol, the disrespect of women, all that stuff. And I was in big trouble with the school, with the law. And I called my dad, and I'll never forget the words. It's hard for me to even say the words without getting emotional because of how significant they are. My dad's pretty stoic. He doesn't say much, but when he says something, you kind of want to lean in and hear what he has to say. And I just go through just everything that I had been participating in and doing. And here's what he said: "Son, your mother and I are not happy with some of the choices that you've made, but you're as much my son today as you ever have been. So if you need to come home, come home. If you need me to come up there, I'll come up there." And here's what happened in that, because had condemnation followed that or criticism followed that, I would have continued to see myself in the way that I was acting and behaving and living out my life. And I would have just, again, continued to perpetuate some of the choices that I was making in that moment. But I saw a picture of my heavenly Father in my earthly father. And so, for a moment, I saw myself as Jesus saw me, which changed everything when I went back a couple weeks later and I'm reading the scripture and I'm seeing the gospel and I'm thinking, man, it's like he loves me. I mean, I knew my dad loved me because what he said, but now it was validated in a way that was healthy. And here's what happens. Man, when you choose to forgive, you allow people not only to see how how you value them and how they're worthy to you, but better yet, how Jesus sees them. You want to see somebody loved into life change? Man, choose to forgive. Choose to forgive. In fact, go a step further and just begin to speak blessing into their life. Hardest thing I do as parent. I mean, I love it, by the way. It's hilarious. That's why I share some of those stories with you. But the hardest thing I do as parent, there's discipline, we're not going to make that decision. What were you thinking there? Put the glue away. And my children, in the midst of the discipline that they must have from me as a parent, they also need to hear blessing in their life so that they know how I see them and how I view them, and even better yet, how God sees them and views them. And you've heard me talk about this before, but there's some prayers that I pray over my girls every single day. Now, I pray over them all the time. But there's a portion of prayers that I pray the same thing every day. When Lucy goes to bed, this is what she hears. She hears a whole bunch, but she always hears this. Lord, remind her that she is beautiful and she is smart, that she is loved by you and loved by her family. That she doesn't have to run or hide because she is safe, and she doesn't have to fear because she is perfectly loved. Because I want her to hear those words of blessing thousands of times before she leaves my house. That's why I pull aside Emma Grace. Man, I was a wreck a couple weeks ago. She was doing a college visit. Saturday, I look over to my wife, and I'm like, I know I travel a little bit, but this is way harder when she's gone from the house. But that's why when she leaves the house, and she will, and she's strong, and she's going to do really well. But every day I just stop her and I say, listen, man, you're one of the most beautiful young ladies I've ever seen. You're wise. She doesn't always love people perfectly, but she loves them as well as she knows. I'm proud of you. And man, what if we did that type of thing in just the relationships that God has given us? I know we have this idea that God, we're to bloom where we're planted, right? I mean, you hear that a lot, bloom where you're planted, and God has given us some linear things to follow. There's some physical things to be at, but He also gives us a stewardship with the relationships that we have. And relationships are tough, right? Like, we love the ones that always love us. We love the relationships that are like our dog. Man, I can go home every day and Humphrey, my big old 100-pound dog, man, he is so happy to see me. But it's hard to love when people don't love you in the same way that your dog does. But what if you steward those relationships in such a way that you not only extended forgiveness to people, but you spoke blessing into their life? And again, as we said from the very beginning, that we're reminded that people do not get judged into life change. They get loved into life change. So would we take Jesus' yoke here, this practice? Again, He doesn't dismiss sin. He doesn't overlook it. But He doesn't continue the perpetual condemnation. Rather, He sees her in a way with love and forgiveness and mercy. How would that change the face of our relationships? Pray with me. Jesus, thank you for this picture, this story, this reality of how you love so well. Lord, help us to walk in that same way. Help us to forgive and to bless, to care for, and to steward your grace as for those of us that where the old is gone and the new has come, that we'd be an ambassador of reconciliation and love. Help us be mindful of what you have done for us. That is the one who ultimately is sinless, you and you alone. You had every right to condemn us again. And rather, you gave us your life. So thank you. In your holy and your precious name, amen. Let me invite you to stand, give you an opportunity to respond this morning. Our staff will be here, would love to talk with you, would love to counsel with you, would love to just pray over you. If there's a question in your mind about whether or not you have a relationship with the King, we would love to begin